welcome fellow audio enthusiasts. Welcome back to another episode of Two-Channel Listening. I'm your host, Jason, and this week we are going to be covering off on the company ADS, more particularly the ADS L1590 speakers from 1986 vintage. Now, to talk about ADS, quite candidly, ADS deserves probably a multi-part series just in itself because of the influence of that particular brand over the 1970s and throughout the 80s, much less influence in the late 90s as they went towards getting dissolved. Unfortunately, in my humble opinion, think that the company ADS, or also known as a subsidiary and importer of Braun speakers from Germany, they are really a underappreciated, unsung hero of very high quality speakers from the 1980s. Now, any of you guys who spend any amount of time on the forums, Audio Karma perhaps, you will see that there are legions of true ADS fans. And we're talking about folks that own no less than 3 sets of ADS at any given time, if not many more. I myself, I have to say, of the 40 different pairs of speakers I've personally owned in the last 11 years, this is pair number 6 of ADS speakers that I've had. No other brands have I had so many speakers. The Tectons come close at, or I should say the Zoos come close at 4 different pairs, and Tectons I've had 3 different pairs. But as you could tell with a few pictures that I'll share with you, I am a huge fan of ADS, and it could be that just as a product of my environment, the very first pair of high fidelity speakers that I grew up on was my father's L710s that he had hooked up to the very Kenwood KR7050 that I still own to this day and works beautifully, along with his Pioneer tuning timer and his JVC 3-head tape deck. I would listen to that tape deck through the Kenwood, through those 710s, year over year, really starting to pay attention to them in 1987, 88, 89, and so on. And those speakers had a huge influence over hearing a well-sorted pair of speakers that could do a lot of things, give it very decent bass, as well as those terrific mid-range and quite high highs. But before really talking about the 1590s that I've had for the last while, I'm going to talk about Dr. Guenther. Dr. Godehard Guenther, NASA engineer and audio legend. Born April 9th, 1939 in Bochum, Germany, Dr. Guenther earned his undergraduate's degree in physics at the University of Göttingen and a PhD in astrophysics at the University of Heidelberg. He funded his studies with freelance photography and geological survey work for clients around Germany. Dr. Guenther joined the National Academy of the Sciences as a fellow in 1968. A year later, recruited by Dr. Wernher von Braun, Dr. Guenther immigrated to the United States, where he worked with a group of scientists at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. He left NASA in 1972 to pursue his growing interest in acoustics, dedicating himself to pushing the size and performance boundaries of existing audio equipment. Now, as it goes, in the 1970s, Dr. Guenther was very displeased with most of the American electronics and the American speakers at that time. So Dr. Guenther was a pioneer in American high-fidelity consumer electronics, in initially importing the Braun loudspeakers in the U.S., thus founding Analog and Digital Systems of Wilmington, Massachusetts, 1972. There he led the development of such innovations as the rare earth metals, including samarium cobalt and neodymium in loudspeakers, the first fully digital surround systems, as well as the first in-wall loudspeakers. Having early on identified the importance of multimedia, Dr. Guenther founded Sound Matters in 1998, basically based out of Reno, Nevada. The desire was to shrink both the size and the cost of true high-fidelity audio. Under the Sound Matters brand, he introduced the first high-quality all-in-one surround system in 2008, as well as the first pocket-sized Bluetooth audio speaker. His gadgets made the top 10 list in Time magazine, as well as his innovations from Sound Matters included projects working for companies such as Logitech, ViewSonic, Roku, and Jawbone, to name just a few. Mr. Guenther had passed in 2014 due to his struggles with gastric cancer. Now, Dr. Guenther, while it was imperative that he be the one to bring the actual German brand Braun to the United States and really give the rise of the high-quality studio monitor components. It was very expensive at that time for Dr. Guenther to actually import the whole speakers from Germany. And so what he did was he actually imported the drivers themselves from Germany. So he used Braun drivers and started to create his own type of cabinets that would house those Braun drivers. But there's another very important part to the actual overall success of ADS in the 1970s and 1980s. And as a brand that most audiophiles should know, Aerial Acoustics, yes, the very Michael Kelly of Aerial Acoustics, as well as Mr. Marshall. So, when you go with Michael Kelly, who is the president and designer of Aerial Acoustics, formed in 1989, you have to go back to 1974, when Michael Kelly pursued an audio design and engineering at Analog and Digital Systems, ADS, where he eventually became the executive vice president. While at ADS, he managed extensive loudspeaker, electronic design, engineering, and production on 2 continents. Wanting to start his own company, he decided to go back and earn his master's degree from MIT. And then he went on to found Aerial Acoustics, where he also, again, partnered with David Marshall, who he brought over from ADS. You have 3 incredibly talented individuals, well-crafted, well-schooled in engineering and design and electronics. This is one of those, I have to say, this is one of those an odd gathering of fellows where it's unfortunate that the actual brand itself, because of financial mismanagement or just didn't have the amount of innovation to stay ahead of the curve, especially as the 90s waned on. It's strange that to this day, it's easy to always look at the lineage of a clip speaker, of an Altec Lansing, or of a JBL, thanks to Lansing. Today, many young aspiring audiophiles, audio enthusiasts, generally only happen upon ADS because they find an old pair of 400 series or 500 series ADS speakers at the local thrift store for $40 to $100. And once they've listened to that 7-inch driver from those smaller monitor size speakers, they become curious. We're in an era where the supply of the drivers and replacements are increasingly scarce. As a matter of fact, as of now, you can no longer actually find a new old stock mid-range driver for most of the ADS speakers. They no longer exist in new form, and they have to be completely rebuilt if for any reason they get smashed in. So let's get to it. Let's talk about my pair of L1590s. These are the Gen 1s, not the version 2s. As I had mentioned, this is my 6th pair of ADS speakers. I've had multiple monitors, and this would be the second of the floor standing brand. This would be the second of the floor standing version that I've owned, having had the actual earlier 80s, 1981 L1230s. The L1230s were the wide baffle design 3-way speaker that had the 8.3-inch woofers. This big boy here, this starts with basically your 3/4-inch tweeter, while many of the specs call it the 1-inch tweeter. It's a 3/4-inch tweeter with your sticky soft dome 2-inch mid-range driver. Now, the magnet on this thing, which I have a picture of, is huge. Yes, these are the infamous sticky dome drivers where you don't touch them, and if you have animals, God help you, you don't want to have them shedding near these speakers because they will turn into a fluffy mess that you just cannot fix. Followed that with the two 10-inch drivers, which is a kind of a paper cardboard that they call a Stifilite material. Now this cast basket monster is 7.45 pounds, an extruded magnet, and surprisingly, when I took this pair out, I knew that the drivers were redone a little while ago, but these were actually stamped when they redid the butyl surrounds, and these were rebuilt in August of 2019 and have a nice little stamp on them. What I was surprised at that I didn't read anywhere is the actual cabling for the woofers themselves is monster cable, a blue and black lead, and that really surprised me to see that. So if any of you long-standing ADS fans out there knew when that partnership came about, or when they started using, I shouldn't say partnership, when they started using that type of cabling for the woofers, I would be curious to know. Speaking of the cabinet, this sucker comes in at 100 pounds, not including these crazy outriggers that I have. Each woofer has its own cabinet, so the bottom woofer is separated with a plate from the upper woofer, and then the upper woofer plays in the entire upper cabinet. The drivers, the mid and the tweeter themselves, because they are a sealed design, there is not another sectioned off cabinet. Basically, you have another plate here, and then there's ribs. There's just some slight ribs that go up along the side to give it a little bit more sustainability and stiffness in the chassis. There's still a bit of that ringing, which you just can't help, because at the end of the day, this was still kind of that fiberish board products that they used in the 80s, and it's 3/4 of an inch thick. The veneers were pretty, but however, the veneers were actually pretty thick on these later designs, and they hold up very well, as you could see by my speakers and the pictures and videos that I've attached. Another interesting piece of trivia is the fact that when you look at the rear cabinets and you look at the bottom at the way there's a cutout plate that you remove to actually insert the speaker cables themselves, these were designed for biamping from the get-go and actually have an attenuator switch on the tweeter. So you can do full biamping to these speakers, as well as from the factory. You could have ordered a very special PA1 plate amp, an AB amp, that fits within that little cutout region at the bottom of the speaker that connects directly to the terminals. And all you needed was a RCA source to plug into each of the left and right speakers. Now this is 1986, folks. That PA1 plate amp worked with both the 1290s and the 1590s only. I would like to repeat that. 1986, and these speakers were designed with plate amps in mind so that all you needed was a source. To my knowledge, I can't think of another speaker like this, of this size, that you could buy powered from the factory. That even beats Meridian Audio out of the UK, which is an awesome company that's been making DSP speakers for many, many, many years. But the first products that actually came from Meridian Audio didn't start out until 1984, 85-ish, and that was their CD player. The powered DSP speakers came later. So I would like to hear from the audience if you know of another speaker like this that actually could come from the factory powered, ready for a source in those early mid-1980s. Now the crossover in these starts from the region of 28 hertz. Basically the speakers play down to 28 hertz minus 3 dB, and the cutoff is at 350 hertz as the handoff to the mid-range. And from the mid-range, it hands off to the tweeter at 5000 K. Now, as somebody who owns a pair of Tectonaroos and did a lot of A and Bing, the crossover in the Tectonaroos is also from the woofer to my ribbon tweeter at 5K. Some very interesting similarities between these speakers and the very Tectonaroos units that I have, totally by accident. Okay, so for my listening impressions, the sonic attributes of the 1590s do precede themselves. They've had a long-standing reputation for being on the rather, say, shouty side. Now, I don't like that word because when I hear shouty, it unfortunately makes me think of a lot of the lower-priced clip speakers where you do get the obvious, this shouting type of sonic signature because of its Tractix horn design. Obviously this is no horn, and I would say that looks are incredibly deceiving. Do not mistake these soft dome tweeters as being warm or dull or dark or reticent. Absolutely the opposite. As a matter of fact, when I first hooked them up for the first 30 minutes of running them in my room, I thought that maybe the crossover had actually been monkeyed with because they were so bright with my Unison Research Unico P. I had never heard that integrated amplifier, that hybrid amplifier, sound so bright before in my room in this house. And so I actually took the crossovers out of the back of the speakers and inspected them to see if indeed they had had different parts or somebody had done something with them. I couldn't believe just how bright the speaker was sounding. So I definitely hit the attenuation switch to knock it back 1.5 dB. And then from that point forward, I basically put the Emotiva 1L monoblocks on that I've borrowed from Dave. And that helped a pretty good amount. While these are efficient speakers, they just respond so much better to having a lot of additional power so that there's no strain with the three-way design. And that brings me to when, listening to, say, Sia, I Go to Sleep, these speakers have an incredible amount of detail retrieval. I will actually say that for even modern speakers below $6,000 price point, these speakers can rival so many speakers up to that $6,000 price point, and in some cases maybe even higher prices. They just amaze at how much these little that little dome tweeter can do, as well as that mid-range. The mid-range, where it takes the handoff from the 10s at 350 hertz, it manages to still give you so much detail on a width scale, but also on a depth scale. There's a big part of me that, with my experience with large speakers, they just naturally have a greater amount of depth. There are some exceptions. I've heard some very large speakers that were still way too forward for me and didn't have the depth that I would expect. Nevertheless, when you have a good three-way design that can put out a lot of SPLs, you just have a larger wall of sound that's coming at you, especially being room dependent. So, with that retrieval, it's kind of a two-way sword, though. I have to say that with different types of quality of the CDs or different types of playback, I happen to be, I hate to admit this, I love Phantom of the Opera. Anytime I bring up that old 1986 Andrew Lloyd Webber album, it actually hurts my ears pretty quickly if I'm listening past 85 dB. It is just a poorly produced CD, or the what it was mastered from, and it is very bright. You listen to Sarah Brightman on these, and it's almost, it kind of pretty much is unlistenable. Just the absolute S's that are thrown out there, just they singe the ear hairs. And so, when you can't think of vintage speakers at all, thinking or putting them all in this category that they're dark or reticent. It is absolutely not the case with the ADS. They have a reputation for being quite bright with particular gear, and the quality of gear matters a lot. I definitely already noticed the differences between having the lower priced NAD with the higher priced Marantz SACD player in my system. They respond really well to quality sources. When listening to Patrick O'Hearn, Panning for Sands, what a great album for listening to the bass lines. Prodigious amount of bass in my room. Just a huge amount of what do you want to say? Just the SPLs that hit you in the chest. You feel it through the floorboards. It comes up through the floor, through your feet, into your legs, and you're getting this body massage from these 10s, because they're, with that 500 watt capability, these things will knock you out through the back wall if you're not careful. And, but that's I hate to say it, that's also the fun of it. Or I shouldn't say hate to say it. These speakers can be a lot of fun when properly matched with the right sources, the right amps, and the right music. It is interesting to me that with the Radiant, the Avalon Acoustic Radians in my system, they're not the best for hard rock. When I put on Tool, these speakers love Tool. These speakers love the heavier metal stuff. When I did that little demo of Alison Cooper's Welcome to My Nightmare, I was enjoying the hell out of that album with these speakers. It just, again, because they're so good at the detail retrieval, but these 10s can just knock you around and slap you about the face and chest. And it makes listening to music a lot of fun with having that kind of a big speaker. And I will say that when I threw the Tecton Arus back in, I had to reorient myself, because I was leaning in almost like, where did the bass go? Even though the Tectons have a 10-inch driver, a very good Eminence 10-inch driver, that 28 hertz versus their 32 hertz in room, it's not the same at all. And it's not the fact that you're losing a few hertz, it's the fact that you're losing the impact of 210s versus 110, and the ability of this acoustically sealed design. There's just something about an acoustic sealed cabinet that really gives you a nice punch, and a good deep punch at that. So, I really struggle to say that the ADS could remain my reference speaker. There's so much that I like about the Tecton Arus when I place them back and forth. at the end of the day, I feel like the Tecton were the better balanced speaker of the two. At no point did I ever get, let's put it this way, I never got fatigued from the Tecton. I could turn them up louder to get more bass energy out of them with the front ports, and then I would start to feel more of that bass. If I did too high a playback with the ADS at any given time, once I hit around the hour mark, I definitely would start to get listener fatigue with the ADS. While it's a hardcore rock out speaker and it has a huge wall of sound, unfortunately there's something that still needs to be done, rather adding another resistor to the tweeter to tone it back a little bit more and just give it a little bit better voicing between it and the mid-range. And the other thing I would say is with that source quality, back to Sia, with I go to sleep or playing lento, when you start to turn it up, the source quality mattered in also the bass bloom. There were times where there was a bit of congestion. There's so much going on with the 210s that they could overwhelm the mid-range level during playback. And there was times where I would hear a little bit of smearing or a little bit of say muddiness, just that whether it was the speed or it was just too much of a good thing, but without a perfect source, without the right amount of power, it could really get to be where, wow, I'm not enjoying them with this song at this level. But yet, when I would play the ADS at night, because they are capable of so much room energy, they really impressed me for night listening. And that's where I would push the Tecton back to the side, and I'd want to hear the ADS at night. Because with them dialed back, that incredible detail retrieval, with having good, a good bass feeling, with good bass notes, with still having a good amount of impact in the room at night for sessions, really made it a wonderful speaker in that context. For the long haul, though, when it comes to the three speakers that I have in array, from the Tecton to the ADS 1590s to the Radians, the Avalon Acoustic Radians, I hate to say that these speakers become, they're the fifth wheel. They don't have the balance of the Tecton, and let alone the long listenability of the Tecton. And then my Avalon Acoustic Radians are on such another level that nothing I've ever owned can even compare to them, that I only want to listen to them for everything, which isn't fair when you're being a reviewer. It makes it impossible to listen to other speakers. You just feel so spoiled. And that creates a conundrum for me, being such a long-time ADS fan and having owned so many pairs of ADS speakers. These remind me of the Zoo Omen Defs that I had. Now, the Zoo Omen Defs have 210s and had, not to confuse anybody, but had the Radian tweeter, that 3-inch compression tweeter in that speaker. There's so many similarities between the Zoo Omen Defs and these. Yet, of the 6 ADS, if you're going to ask me, okay, of all those ADS speakers that you owned, which are the ones that would be worth going back out and finding to have for the long term? That would be the L1230s. The L1230s with the wide baffles and the 8.3-inch dual 8s. That was a very well-balanced speaker for me at the time, with the gear I had at that time, all these disclaimers. And again, I had a very large living room that those speakers were in. I had vaulted ceilings. The room was 16 by 21 deep, and lots of carpet. Just a really a terrific room for big speakers. And those definitely excelled within that environment. And I did have really good electronics hooked up to them at that time. it really does pain me because these are rare birds, and the ADS line just deserves at least one turn for every good audiophile. While I'll say that every audiophile, to be a true audiophile, has to have owned an NAD product once in your lifetime, you have had to have listened to at least one pair of ADS speakers in your lifetime to really get an understanding of where we are at today with modern speakers, with modern designs, how scarily impressive these old design speakers are and what they're capable of. With a little bit of crossover work, they could still beat lots of modern speakers at anywhere near the $5,000 price point. That's my opinion. You can take it as being as biased as you want. I would say that with a little bit of work on the crossovers, dialing down that little hotness that these things can get, you'd be hard pressed to find any speaker that could beat them if you invested, say a total of $1,200 into these. I mean, come on, two well-crafted 10s, a well-crafted mid, a well-crafted tweeter in a 100-pound body. You're just not going to find that these days. Everything else is lots of 6s or an array of 5¼ inch drivers or whatever the case is. They're just still not capable of putting out the sound pressure in a room. And again, your room it's dependent on how large your room is. If you've got a small room, these will blow you right out through the back wall. In conclusion, when it comes to speaker companies these days and the corporations that own all the different brands, you look at Sound United Group that owns Marantz and Denon and Class A these days, and they're using a lot of the same material across those products. You're hard pressed nowadays to find the kind of brain power that a small company like look in your local classifieds, look at your Craigslist. They are lurking out there. There's going to be some 470s. There's going to be some 630s, some even 780s, which I owned a pair of 780s. Very nice monitor speaker. You will be able to get those for maybe $200 to $300 in good shape. Is money well spent towards your audio education? I would just have a hard time getting rid of these speakers, even though I've got two other speakers that are just better, well suited to my listening preferences. And that's where I'm at with this episode. I appreciate those of you who tuned in. I will be getting around to the Philharmonic BMR V2. So tune in for that. Thank you and have a great week, everybody.